All of our First Wednesday panelists are distinguished. Today's is no different. Joining us are Roger Sedjo, to Roger's left, Nigel Purvis, Jim Baker, and Lynn Scarlett. Roger is a senior fellow at RFF, and for 25 or so years he's directed our Forest Economics and Policy program. Notice, well before forests were as headline-making as they are today. And Roger is well known here in the U.S. and internationally for his work at the intersection of economics and forestry. Nigel is a visiting scholar here at RFF. He's also a non-resident scholar at the Brookings Institution and the president of Climate Advisors. Nigel also has significant experience as a diplomat and has served in a number of leadership capacities in other NGOs. And it's truly been a delight and an honor to have him at RFF for the past year or so. Jim Baker, of course, is the former administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He never retires. He's now the director of the Global Carbon Measurement Program at the William J. Clinton Foundation. He, too, brings a vast amount of statesmanship service to this nation. I'm particularly impressed, as you'll see on his biography, that in addition to leading oceanographic expeditions, Jim has a patent for a deep-sea pressure gauge. Lynn Scarlett was the former Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Department of Interior. She, too, has served this nation in a number of stateswoman instances, and she chaired the Interior's Climate Change Task Force and the Federal Wildland Fire Leadership Council. So these forestry experts are gathered today to talk about what we've broadly titled Challenges and Opportunities in Managing Global Forests. What do we mean by that? Well, I think we all know the many attributes of a forest. For one thing, for many, many people, it's a source of livelihood, fuel wood, other purposes. It's also an important source of timber and wood products for a very important industrial sector. Forests provide watershed protection, habitat, beauty. Now, an intact forest also stores carbon, and this carbon sequestration is another attribute of forests, and it's probably the most headline-making attribute of forests in contemporary policy. And on that point, if you look at the projected costs for U.S. climate policy approaches under various estimates from the Energy Information Administration, Environmental Protection Agency, Congressional Budget Office, domestic policy approach without managing forests for their carbon storage properties is significantly more expensive than an approach exploiting this valued attribute of forests. But as I said, there are competing demands other than the storing of carbon made on our forests. So we've got a lot of details to work out among these competing demands and some details to work out how to manage forest carbon as well. And that's what these experts have been working on for the better part of probably several years at this point. So in that regard, Nigel has led development of a means of relating the geography, governance, and the relative value of different uses of forest in an index. And he'll speak a little bit about the Forest Carbon Index. Jim is leading an initiative linking forest carbon and its management in alleviating poverty. And Lynn has long considered forests in a portfolio of U.S. land management issues. And along with Nigel and Jim, Lynn was a commissioner on the Commission on Climate and Tropical Forests, whose report and recommendations were recently released. So let me circle back to Roger, then I'm going to step over here and get our discussion going. So despite this prominence of forests on the policy agenda, we have a rather disturbing fundamental problem, which is that we cannot say with much accuracy how many acres of forests there are in the world, or in regions, or even in some countries. And this matters because we need a better quantitative understanding of forests to, number one, understand their role in the global carbon cycle from a science perspective, and number two, for what quantities we have to manage in formal or informal forest carbon market-like mechanisms. So we have more detailed maps of the skies and even of Mars than we have of global forests. And a clue to the problem is that the skies and Mars are not nationally sovereign resources, but a nation's forests are nationally sovereign resources, and it's partly a matter of national will and technical means, the extent to which one measures and monitors one's forests. And it may well be, I think, as our panelists would agree, that carbon markets may underpin and provide very strong incentives for nations to demonstrate measurement and monitoring of forests. But in any case, Roger's going to start off by telling us some of the challenges in measurement. Can we even do better if we wanted to? Do we have the technical means, if you will? And what kinds of institutional designs may bring forth better measures? Then I have a set of questions for each of the additional panelists. And then there will be ample opportunity for the audience engagement, your questions and your comments, which is the heart and soul of our First Wednesday seminar series. So I'm going to step away from here and move over here, but while I'm doing it, Roger, would you give us the 20-second tutorial, if you will, of what it means to measure and monitor a forest?
Thank you, Molly. She gave me 3 minutes before to reduce to 20 seconds. I thought I was going to have to exceed the 3 minutes. But let me say that the question of the adequacy of the world's forests has been an outstanding question for a long period of time. The adequacy and even just physically, what's the physical amount that's out there. There was early work that was done in the 1920s. Our first global estimate came out. In the 1970s, another improved estimate came out. The FAO got involved in this in the early 1980s with estimates of area. So we're not talking about all the dimensions of forest, but we're talking about area. We worked on a project a few years ago and discovered that the data that's available seems to be not very good. And so out of that came an arrangement with Sloan Foundation to look at the adequacy of the data that we have for forests, ask questions about how good it is, and if it's not as good as it needs to be, what are the technological limits on that, what are the financial limits on that, and where do we need to go, what do we need to do to get from here to a far better set of estimates that are much more useful. So the project was developed with the Sloan Foundation and ourselves. We have had a one-year preliminary set of activities to try to get our arms around this. There are 3 or 4 outputs of this project. One of the outputs is a review of what's out there in terms of the data, how consistent are the different data and the different estimates of forests across articles and through time, and we found a lot of problems. And there is a RFF discussion report on that that shows some of the great inconsistencies out there. And this has been recognized for a while. We've just sort of pinned it down and documented it. A second paper coming out of the study has looked at the technology, where it is and what the potentials are over the next few years. A third paper is looking at what we need, how good is good enough for the various uses that we have. And then we hope to, the fourth paper, which might be a proposal to a follow-on, make some suggestions about where we need to go from here and develops a framework for a better, more comprehensive system of measuring and monitoring. The starting point for this is kind of the framework that we developed that came out of a 2006 paper as to what questions, what measurements, what data we need. The first one, and most people are dealing with that, is the area. How much area is there in forests? And we've got remote sensing and different approaches to measuring that. It turns out that those measurements are not always very good. So this is the two-dimensional question. The three-dimensional question is how much volume is there? And foresters have been concerned about this and looked at this question and sometimes try to measure growing stocks, which is very common in the forestry area. A third question is biomass, and that is not the volume of the trees in the wood, but the dry weight of that. And biomass is important because once you have biomass, you can estimate carbon with a great deal of precision. So we have a lexicon here that goes from area to volume to biomass to carbon. That's what we're trying to look at. We're asking questions, how can we measure that? and what are we doing now, and where might we go to improve our measurements. Now, field measurements have been around for a long while. The U.S. Forest Service has had systematic measurements since the early 1950s, and we now have some 60 years of measurements of the U.S. forest using a sampling system and then field measurements, and looking through time and doing that on a 10 or 5-year basis on a continuing process. So that's one way of doing it, and the Forest Service is now using various kinds of remote sensing to supplement that on-the-ground kind of approach. Remote sensing seems to be the key to doing a more comprehensive and precise job, accurate job of doing this. There are 3 kinds of remote sensing we can talk about. One is optical, a 2-dimensional kind of thing, in the spirit of what Landsat satellites have been collecting for years. And you would think that would be pretty straightforward, but even there the data is not always consistent. One of the problems is definition, what constitutes a forest, but it's more complicated than that. There are other dimensions to it. The other approaches in the remote sensing area include optical kinds of things, again, the Landsat, a radar approach, various kinds of radar, and a laser approach that's emerging called LIDAR, which is a laser technology. These 2 last approaches begin to give a 3rd dimension to the measurement of forests. And these can be applied on fairly smaller areas of land fairly effectively, although there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between the area your laser estimate, or the volume your laser estimates, and the actual volume. There may be some differences, errors in the basic techniques. Ideally, good measurement would probably use both remote sensing that's informed by field measurements. Now, there are problems here, and I'm going to talk about problems related to carbon, because there's a lot of discussion about measuring forests throughout the world and then providing carbon credits for changes in that forest volume, or the carbon captured in that forest. We've got some serious problems there, though. One is the areas, of course, are huge and vast. Another is some countries are resisting monitoring, and you may be able to go over them with satellites, but you may not be able to use some of the other techniques that are airborne and ground sensing. So you're all limited there with some countries that don't want to be involved in this game. One of the biggest problems, I think, the most daunting problem in my view, is the question of leakage. I can put a fence around a forest. I can go in there and I can measure it. I can estimate the carbon with a great deal of precision, and I can see changes in that over time as different things impact on that forest. What I can't see is what's happened outside of that forest area because it's been taken out of the system, if you will, the deflection that has occurred. And a good example, there is a literature on deflection for the U.S., which is called leakage. And for the U.S., it estimates that leakage might be from 10% to 90%. So there's a big volume there. An example of leakage could be found in the 1990s. The U.S. Forest Service essentially took the National Forest System, 30% of our forest, out of the timber base. The markets continue to operate. What happened to total harvest in the U.S.? Nothing. They stayed essentially the same across the 1990s. How come? Because they harvested more private lands in the Pacific Northwest and they harvested more private lands in the South. Also, consumption actually went up. Where did that come from? Canada. So if you think of this, where's the leakage here? It's from public to private lands, and it's from the U.S. across the border. So this is quite a daunting task, and the idea that somehow we can put fences around areas and measure the carbon in there and monitor them over time without somehow considering this broader issue of leakage, that is a very daunting problem. So if we look at these issues, what we find is that the data today is inaccurate in much of the world. Very good in some places, not very good in other places. We have a much better ability to measure area than we do wood volume or carbon, especially if we want precision in our carbon estimates for trading in markets. There is some new technology coming along that could help a lot. Some of it's expensive, and some of it is probably 5 to 10 years down the road. So today the technology may not exist or exist in the abundance that we need. 10 years from now, we may have very good or much better technology, etc. So I guess the bottom line is there's great opportunity because using forests to sequester carbon has tremendous potential and tremendous potential advantages in terms of reducing the cost of meeting our carbon problem. But on the other hand, our ability to measure it with precision and accuracy at this point in time, there are lots of problems with that, and it turns out to be a very daunting task.
So, thanks, Roger. Now, RFF style, when we approach research problems, is in the kind of measured, data-intensive way that Roger has outlined. Now, the problem is that policy is moving very, very quickly. And I want to ask Nigel to describe, just briefly, for reasons that he'll describe why he won't go into it in great length today, the idea of the Forest Carbon Index, which builds on the kind of data Roger has just described, but the index has to sort of make do with what do we have today to begin to inform policy that is moving so very, very quickly. And so, Nigel, tell us the challenges, but the opportunities of a device like a Forest Carbon Index that takes account of the data that Roger has described, but also tries to help inform the fast pace of which policy moves.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for including me today. It's always a pleasure to be here at RFF and a great opportunity to talk about some terrific work that has been done here with colleagues, really talented staff that has been working to assemble the data that is available so that we can begin to inform this rapidly evolving climate policy situation. I started working on the intersection between climate and forest as a climate negotiator at the State Department, and the position of the Clinton administration and even the Bush administration, in which I served, was that we really ought to be working on forests, and there was some skepticism. There was which forest, where, how much money, what's it going to do to the local situation, what's it going to do to social communities and to efforts to alleviate poverty. And really what we had in response at the time was a concept, which is, in theory, saving forests ought to be cost effective, and maybe it's good for people, but it's a huge part of the emissions problem. Currently, the IPCC estimates that's about 17% of global emissions, which, if that's correct, and there's a little bit of debate about that, but if that is correct, it's more than the emissions from the entire global transport sector, all of the planes, trains, automobiles in the world. And yet, Kyoto, the lion's share of this comes from deforestation, and Kyoto the protocol did not deal with that part of the problem. So there was a real sense that this was an issue that needed more work. We needed more clarity about where this carbon could be saved and increased, and what would be the social consequences, what would be the economic consequences. And when I was at the Nature Conservancy, which is, of course, is an organization, part of whose mission is to promote forest conservation, we had similar questions as well. And so coming to Resources for the Future, it was really exciting to me to be here with an opportunity to try and assemble this data to be able to analyze that. And we have done our best, and we call it the Forest Carbon Index. It is a project that has taken about a year and a half to get to where we are today. It's about 1 month from rollout. So around this time next month at RFF, there'll be a public release and a launch of an interactive website that allows users to play with data and model the geography of forest carbon under various climate policy constraints and frameworks. We have taken data about the above-ground carbon stock, such as it is, around the world, both actual and potential, and we've paired that with economic data about the opportunity cost of land to come up with an idea of the places that could be either converted into forest or preserved as forest in a cost-effective manner. In addition, we've married that with information from the World Bank and some custom work that Molly led here with Aaron Myers to try and determine which countries have the capacity and the right governance conditions. We've taken information about corruption and rule of law and married that together with information about business conditions and the attractiveness of a country to foreign investors or even local investors, and then married it also with information about the capacity to participate in carbon markets, the access to remote sensing, access and capacities domestically about forest institutions and experience with environmental markets. And we put that all together to try and illuminate the likely geography of forest carbon. And the results are pretty exciting. There's some very specific maps that come down to a 10 by 10 square mile grid that will provide at least an initial place to inform investors who are in fact today making decisions about where to invest in forest carbon, and even more importantly in my mind, to inform the policy community which is designing a forest carbon policy framework both here in the United States in climate legislation that is pending in Congress, and also internationally in the Copenhagen process. And there are a few insights. I won't go into a huge amount of detail about our findings because that's the purpose of our December meeting. We hope you'll all come back to that. But there are some pretty significant insights, and that the geography of forest carbon really changes dramatically based on governance, and that implies that we need different kinds of policy mechanisms that use and harness the power and resources of the private sector to work in countries that have a capacity to attract private capital and a willingness to allow private capital, and also public funding to fill in the gaps, to work with countries that are not yet really attracted to the private sector, and where rates of deforestation may not be high enough, but where there may be risks of leakage. So that you need public monies to come in and help conserve those forests. Not that we won't be reducing deforestation, but we'll be guarding against increases in deforestation. And so this insight that you need public money, you need private money, and that the evolving geography is quite knowable and concrete, and we can help both investors and developing countries themselves identify the places within those countries where investments should be explored more fully. And because of the data limits that Roger described, we don't see this as a recipe for action, but we see it as an invitation to further inquiry. It's an opportunity for the policy community and for the investor community to begin to burrow in on particular places and to see more clearly what the opportunities are and what the risks are. One of the findings is that there are an enormous quantity of potentially cost-effective tons, in a well-designed climate system, whether it's a national law or a global climate agreement, that the quantity is enormous, that in fact about a quarter of the emission reductions that the world needs between now and 2020 could come from the forest sector in a very cost-effective manner, less than $20 a ton, which is really not that different from what the European Union companies are paying under their European emissions trading system, and that the overall cost savings to developed countries who would partner with developing countries to help finance these reductions would be on the order of about $40 to $50 billion. That's net, even after taking into account the cost of investment, and that the flows to developed countries would also be very substantial, about $20 billion over this period, and annually over this period, which is really more than twice the total amount of development assistance that the United States provides to the developing world. So huge opportunities for new resources for developed countries to align with a poverty alleviation agenda and economic opportunity agenda. Huge risks because, of course, we've got to have the systems in place to ensure public participation and transparency and control of corruption and real accountability. And so a real call to action for the policy community to be very, very active in including forests in climate policy, both at the national level and globally, but also to design the program in an intelligent way that allows for the real opportunity to ensure that local communities have a say in how their natural resources are used and managed, and to ensure that these financial flows are serving multiple foreign policy objectives, not just climate change-related ones, but they're helping with mitigation, they're helping with adaptation, but they're also helping with poverty alleviation and social justice and local security and U.S. national security. So it's an exciting project. I invite you all back for that, and one that I think is well timed to inform the Copenhagen process and also the action in the Senate.
Nigel, thanks. Do you have a date for that yet, or is
So it's December 2nd or 3rd, and the
watch
communications
the
team
website.
just watch the website.
So, Roger built the case for attributes of forest, including but extending beyond carbon, so area, volume, biomass, carbon. Nigel helped set the stage for the particular attribute of carbon in a decision-making context. And Nigel alluded to two things in particular that the rest of our panel can continue our dialogue on. One is Nigel linked it to poverty reduction issues, which is a prominent theme that Jim is spearheading at the Clinton Foundation, and I've asked him to describe that effort. And the second thing Nigel alluded to, where our panel has tremendous expertise, is what is the current state of play with respect to policy development, particularly in the United States. So I'll circle back and engage our panel on the policy issue in a minute, but if Jim, if you will, talk about the Clinton initiative, and then I know that you're the only panelist who brought a PowerPoint, and it's a very important one, and it might be a very helpful framing device if you'd like to also have it shown while you're speaking.
Okay. Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been working for the past year and a half or so with the Clinton Foundation, and the focus of the Clinton Foundation has been to work directly with the governments of developing countries to try to develop large-scale projects that can be replicated and then used as models to show how we can reduce emissions. And in particular, we have a forestry program that has the goals of helping developing countries be compliant with whatever international regulations come out of Copenhagen or later, to attract investment to forestry projects through carbon markets and other mechanisms, foreign aid, for example. And then third, as Molly said, to empower poor communities in developing countries to participate and benefit from the investment. So our focus has been not so much on the international policies, but really on specific countries. What is it that a particular country needs to do to get into this game, and how can you start with the capacity you have, build on it, and then build on the increasing knowledge that comes up. So we have two things that we are focusing on. One is we're helping our partner countries. We have 4 countries we're working in. We're helping them develop these monitoring, reporting, and verification systems that tell us what's there with the forest carbon. And Roger's pointed out some of the difficulties and uncertainties in that. And the second thing is to actually carry out subnational scale, smaller scale projects within the countries, and to see if we can put together the project, have it benefit the communities, and find the financing. So this is very much an on-the-ground program to help these countries structure what they need to get ready for whatever comes out of Copenhagen and later, because we know this is going to happen. I think that the two things that I think we can all be certain of in the climate world is there's going to be more CO2 in the atmosphere, and the second is there's going to be a price on carbon. When the price happens, we don't know, but I think we need to have countries get ready for that. Our program is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. The Clinton Foundation itself is not a foundation with a lot of money. We have Bill Clinton as a person who can raise money for projects. And so we're funded by Rockefeller. We have a 5-year program to work in 4 countries. We're working in Guyana, in South America, in Kenya and Tanzania, and in Cambodia. And then we have a subnational scale project that we're carrying out in Indonesia, actually, with the support of Norway, and I think we're making some very good progress on that. And maybe I should just show the slide to give a sense. Can we put the slide up? Give you an idea of what we're trying to accomplish here. Okay, we turn down the lights. We can provide a copy of this for people to either through our website or something like that, so you have a chance to see it here.
There's a limited amount of light we can turn down because this is on our being videoed. So
I just have one slide, but it encapsulates the kind of framework that we're talking about. there's this part here, was the National Monitoring System for Forest Carbon, which, as Roger was pointing out, requires data from satellites and field studies and so on. Requires some kind of model that tells you, given the data, what's the carbon, and then an information system, a geographical information system, that takes that information and then provides it out, reporting national accounts, and allows you to verify your accounts. This is a national monitoring system. There are uncertainties of the data are built into this as we start out for each of our developing countries. Some will have more uncertainty than others. You have to start small, build on the capacity that's there, and build from that. This information feeds into what we call a decision support tool. Many of the developing countries today have in place what they call a low-carbon development strategy. There was a recent paper that ODI just did that showed that there's something like 15 developing countries have a low-carbon development strategy or green development strategy. And in that strategy, you have to balance what you have with forests with what you have with mining and hydropower and roads and development. All of this has to be done. If you need a way to actually make those decisions, what the decision support tools do for you is to say, if I build a mine in one place, a new gold mine, for example, in Guyana, what do I have to do with my farming, my rice, my sugar? What about the roads? What are the trade-offs that I have to do in order to keep my carbon emissions low? The decision support tool is a way of taking the information from the monitoring and data system and allowing the government to make those decisions, or allowing a private sector person who says, I want to do a project in a certain area. What's the impact on the carbon? What can I do about it? My point here is that you need this full set, this whole framework, in order to get engaged with the process of whatever comes out of Copenhagen, with the markets and so on. The markets will want to know with some accuracy how much carbon is there so they can pay for the offsets or credits. And the international regulations will want to know whether you are in fact compliant with what you said you did. And so this full set of pieces has to be put in place. You don't have to do the whole thing at once, and you don't have to have it as up to speed as it is, say, in the developed countries. But this is very similar to the way we started out the world with weather forecasting. We didn't wait until we had all of the science to do weather forecasts. We simply did the best we could, iterated, adjusted, and today, slowly, weather forecasting improves, if you believe that weather forecasting is improving. It actually has, if you look at the scientific measures. But there's a process. Start with what you have, build the capacity, and go forward. And that's what we've been doing in the Clinton Foundation, is helping countries understand what capacity they have for each of these elements, what do they need to develop further, who are the technology providers, how does it come together, and then how can we pay for it? And fortunately, Norway, as a country, has said we will be the leader in providing funding for putting in monitoring and verification systems in countries. Countries need to write proposals to Norway. Norway then has agreed to put something like, I think it's about $10 billion into forest monitoring systems and helping save tropical rainforests around the world. Norway is the leader. I think we all hope that the U.S., the Commission report, is one of the points in saying the U.S. needs to step up and join Norway in funding this. But this is one of the new things that's happened, is that Norway has come forward and said, if you can put together a plan, we'll provide the funding to get us started. Now, they're not going to provide the funding continually. This has to be then transferred over to the private sector or to government buying credits or whatever. But that's 5 to 7 years off, something like that. We don't really know. So in the meantime, there has to be interim funding. And so the interim funding for the MRV systems and the decision support tools is now coming from Norway. Norway is very active in trying to make this happen in countries and internationally. They're funding the World Bank Carbon Partnership Facility Program. They're funding the UN to look at the reduction of emissions through deforestation and degradation. So Norway's been a very big player, and I think one of the things we hope, as Nigel was talking about, is the U.S. can also step up to this. That's kind of a quick summary of where we are.
So you might think that being in Washington, what are federal agencies thinking about? And I've asked Lynn, although she stepped aside from the Interior Department at the moment, she still has a good read on the U.S. federal government begins to think about climate policy writ large, share some thoughts and insights and intuitions about the federal agencies in this section.
Thanks, Molly. Well, thank you for including me. And I am going to give a slightly different vantage point, the vantage point of someone who comes recently as a land manager and practitioner in the context of forests as well as other lands. I want to address the question of climate in that context by first stepping back and setting the stage for some of the larger ongoing issues that pertain to forest management on public lands. And by the way, this applies both to federal and I believe also state lands. Of course, the federal government manages together between the Forest Service and Interior several 100 million acres of forests, so forests are a big deal for the federal agencies. I want to delineate 4 issues and then talk about those issues both in terms of the metrics issues that were raised by Roger, Nigel, and Jim, and then also link those discussions to climate. First issue, of course, for federal agencies is just the very broad question of how do we enhance forest health. While I was at Interior, it was concluded that some 180 million acres managed by the federal government were not in good health, partly as a consequence of years of Smokey the Bear policy of suppressing fire in places that in fact were fire-adapted ecosystems and needed that fire. As a consequence of that long-time suppression, we have tree stand densities sometimes very significantly greater than even their pre-Columbian densities. And so that presented a significant challenge. How do we enhance forest health? I want to link for a moment that question to the issue of metrics. And one of the challenges that we faced was just exactly how do you measure forest health. Roger talked in terms of extent of forests, amount of timber, then the getting ultimately to the carbon question. But we were really asking a different kind of question, which is what constitutes forest health? How do you develop those metrics? That brings me to three other issues. So we have enhancing forest health, obviously a very big picture concept, but very much related to that was deep concern and billions of federal dollars expended on the matter of trying to address the increased incidence of catastrophic wildland fires. And we have a conundrum because on the one hand, wildland fires are natural. There are fire-adapted ecosystems. On the other hand, we were beginning to see wildland fires that we began to call catastrophic in nature, that is unnatural in their dimensions, the intensity with which they burned and the speed and extent with which they spread. Now, the causes of that and the risks associated with it are multifaceted. Some of the causes are associated with that poor forest health that I mentioned. Chronic drought adds to the complicating factors. And then, of course, the risk is increased because of the significant increase in the wildland-urban interface. That is the encroachment of urban settlement to what used to be forest lands out in the middle of nowhere. Again, as we looked at the issue of catastrophic wildland fires, we faced the question of where does one do these fuels treatment, that is the removal of some underbrush and some small diameter trees to thin these areas out. And again, we faced significant metrics challenges and launched with the U.S. Geological Survey a project called Land Fire, trying to do multiple layered vegetation mapping and other mapping to soil moisture, terrain, many map layers to better give us a sense of where fires have historically burned, if lightning struck and fires were ignited, which direction would they move, therefore where did we most need to do fuels treatment, since we couldn't obviously do fuels treatment on 180 million acres. That was not, from a budget standpoint, going to be feasible. Now I want to pause here and say that also there is some research that suggests that these forest conditions we're seeing, that the increased intensity of wildland fires and their increased frequency is potentially related to some of the effects of a changing climate, both in terms of the chronic drought conditions, changes in precipitation patterns, and so on. And indeed, just to give you a little factoid, right now, the wildland fire season is about 78 days longer than it was just about 2.5 decades ago. So it presents significant management challenges. So moving beyond enhancing forest health and moving beyond the very ever-present challenge of wildland fire, two other big issues that confront federal managers of forests right now. And again, there is a nexus to climate, possibly. And one is the spread of disease, and in particular pests such as bark beetles, where we have huge outbreaks of bark beetles. Again, a natural phenomenon has occurred for time immemorial. But the challenge that we're seeing now in places like the Rockies is that where the bark beetle spread used to be curtailed somewhat because of the onset of cold enough temperatures that essentially would stop the life cycle of those beetles and therefore constrain their spread to a given season. We're now seeing some of these pests thrive through a season and into the next, and therefore spread over dimensions that truly are in the millions of acres if you go up to British Columbia, for example. Now, again, if we asked our scientists, is this caused by climate change? Nobody is quite willing to make that causal linkage. Nonetheless, there's some suggestion that some of the changing conditions brought about by a changing climate might indeed be associated with that spread of disease. And I'll just end on another major issue that is an ongoing challenge for federal agencies, and then again link it to something that both Nigel and Jim talked about, and that is these forests under the Gifford-Pinchot framework were created largely with the idea that they would be working landscapes, that is, forests that would provide resources to the nature in the form of timber. Changing conditions, both changing value sets and changing conditions, have begun to alter that purpose for these forests and significantly introduce the emphasis on watershed protection, biodiversity, conservation in general. But that brings to the fore a challenge, and that is just exactly what is the right balance of sustaining working landscapes and some access, while at the same time maintaining and sustaining these forests in as healthy ecosystems. And that is a key challenge as the Climate and Tropical Forest Commission worked on its recommendations, a key challenge we faced in the international setting as well. Indonesia, Brazil, and elsewhere are not seeing their forests cut down simply for the joy of cutting them down. Largely, it's driven by some sort of economic activity, sometimes legal, sometimes not legal. But it presents the challenge of, as one moves to try and avoid deforestation and all the adverse consequences that deforestation holds for a changing climate, how exactly does one address the economic needs of often these very poor communities, making the work that Jim talked about incredibly important? It was something we struggled with. And I want to leave you with a thought that neither Nigel and Jim emphasized, and that is one of the issues we faced in that climate and tropical forests discussion was carbon markets are largely directed at activities such as reforestation and afforestation. What about avoided deforestation, where you've got, for example, an indigenous population in Brazil that both by law and by culture has sustained their forests intact, and most carbon market structures don't have a means of accommodating payments for avoided deforestation in that context because you won't pass the additionality test. And so this is something we struggled with and talked about the need for some flow of funds that could benefit those communities that might not be able to play in a traditional carbon market. But in any event, summarizing, I think those are the key federal issues, and there's a tremendous intersection both with metrics challenges, as was described, and also some of those ongoing issues do have a nexus to the climate challenge. And sorry, one more thing I want to mention. Interior also houses the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we were very much involved with the U.S. Forest Service in beginning to develop the protocols for carbon measurements that would be the basis for carbon sequestration and carbon markets. And one of the challenges that we faced is that there is a tension between those who would press for metrics that may result in, for example, rapidly growing forests that generate significant sequestration. But, for example, the context for that rapid growth and that high sequestration may in fact come in the form of a monoculture. The Fish and Wildlife Service very concerned that we have a multidimensional, not unidimensional framework as we think about these challenges and keep in play co-benefits such as biodiversity as we think about land management in the forestry context. That's an issue that also plays out internationally, but it was one we were struggling with directly at the Interior Department, which actually participated in about 80,000 acres of some carbon sequestration voluntary market transactions.
Yeah, Lynn, thank you. I think you've brought full circle the key points that I was hoping that our panel would share with our audience. Now, Nigel alluded to the rapidity of U.S. legislative policy proposals, and he's also been front and center in much of that, and I was going to ask him to summarize briefly the state of thought in Congress. And then because we do have three of the commissioners from the Tropic Forest Commission, Lynn has already mentioned one or two of the key findings, but I wanted you to give the audience a flavor for what, it's not a presidentially ordained commission, it's a differently structured. Nigel will speak to that. So some policy issues and your recommendations, and then we will open it for your questions and comments. Nigel,
so just a brief statement about the climate bills that are in Congress. The bill that was approved by the House in June is a very forest-friendly bill, both domestically and internationally. I'll speak to the international components because those are the ones that are where the most tons are in play. But there are two principal mechanisms under that bill for including forests in climate policy. The first is that a proportion of the revenue that would be generated through a cap-and-trade program, the auctioning of emission permits to companies, regulated entities, a portion of that revenue is set aside to work directly with developing countries to conserve their forest stock and to help reduce deforestation. And the flows are, under the House bill, really quite substantial, starting at several billion dollars a year and rising to about $5 billion by 2020. A very significant U.S. contribution to a global solution. And there's a second mechanism, which is in this idea of offsets, that regulated companies that are regulated under the cap-and-trade program will be eligible to meet a portion of their compliance obligation by investing in emission reduction opportunities internationally. Those international offsets, as they're known, include forests. The EPA analysis of the House bill suggests that roughly 60% of the international offsets would come from tropical forests because of the potential to have very low-cost emission reductions. So when you combine the mitigation achieved under the spending of public monies raised through the auctioning of emission permits, together with the revenue that would be mobilized in the private sector for forest conservation through the offset mechanism, the total mitigation achieved under the bill that relates to forests is about 43% of the total tons. So we don't think of it this way because it's kind of wonky, but really the Waxman-Markey bill is really a forest bill as much as it is anything. More than any other share or any other sector of emissions, it's going to be forest emissions that are tackled first. And that actually makes a great deal of sense because we don't need to invent any new technology to stop cutting trees. And so forests can be a bridge to that low carbon energy future that we need some time to develop. And it's an opportunity to, and also these forests are disappearing at a very substantial rate, as Roger mentioned. And so the opportunity for action to conserve the carbon stock is now. And if we wait, we'll lose that opportunity. So there's urgency, there's opportunity, and there are cost savings, and there are co-benefits for biodiversity and poverty if we do this right. So the House bill, makes, in my view, makes an awful lot of sense. The Senate bill is pretty similar. It's, there are a few differences around the edges, but for brevity, I'll just say that the bill that was approved today by the Environment and Public Works Committee, through a somewhat unorthodox procedure, it has some very similar provisions, and in particular, it has both of these mechanisms, offsets and the setting aside of revenue from the auction of emission permits. And Molly, as you know, I have to leave shortly for our engagement in the Senate, and I do apologize for that. But I wanted to give both Lynn and Jim the due that they are they deserve for the leadership role that they play in helping to be a part of this, leading this U.S. Commission on Climate and Tropical Forests, which is an independent entity that was funded by the Packard Foundation, but is a group of very prominent individuals in the U.S. policy and business process. There are folks, it's bipartisan. There are folks from the foreign policy and national security community, scientists such as Jim, people who are working on domestic forest issues, and like Lynn, together with people in the international development community, conservation community, the labor community, really multi-sector approach. And the idea was for this commission to come together and come up with some consensus recommendations. And one of the, John Podesta and Lincoln Chafee chaired the commission. Chuck Hagel was one of the early sign-ons, and immediately it was very clear that if you had one of the most progressive voices in climate policy and also one of the principal opponents of the Kyoto Protocol, if they could agree on something in climate policy, that maybe there's something there. And what I was really delighted to discover is that the commission was very like-minded, that there was really seeing that it doesn't really matter what you think about climate policy. If you think climate change is a real problem, the United States should be leading an international partnership to work with developing countries to reduce deforestation. And the primary recommendations, I hope that Lynn and Jim can speak to the specific, but the primary recommendation was for the U.S. to set out on a very ambitious task to reduce tropical deforestation in half by 2020 with the goal of achieving zero net deforestation globally by 2030. Extraordinarily ambitious goals, as I'm sure Roger will be right in noting, very, very stretched goals, but ones that are consistent with climate science and with the climate economics, and therefore this very diverse group of community planting that flag out there and drawing attention to it as the Senate debate moves forward, I think is a tremendous contribution that they have made. So my apologies for leaving, and congratulations to both of you for the role you played.
Well, thanks, Nigel, and we'll check back with you in December.
Great, thank you.
So I think because Nigel did capture some of the highlights of the commission's findings, I want to turn it over to questions and comments. So there's a microphone that will come to you, and would you tell us who you are? First, Roger wants the word in edgewise, and that's only fair. So.
Yeah, I just want to add one more comment. This is kind of good news and bad news. I mean, one of the other features making this whole task more daunting is what Lynn mentioned in terms of climate change impacting forests. So we've got this feedback occurring here. On the one hand, we're trying to maintain forests for the carbon. On the other hand, we're going to have climate change disturbing the system. So that, in fact, complicates the matter. Indeed, it turns out that most of the evidence suggests that at least for the next 50 years or so, through the middle of this century, perhaps the end of this century, the changes in climate that we anticipate are likely to have a small positive effect on forests. Globally, we expect forest productivity to go up and forest in principle to expand. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that some existing forests may not be badly disturbed due to infestations and a whole host of other things. My point is not to say that this is mission impossible, but to point out that this is really quite complicated. We've got forces moving in several directions simultaneously, and it's pretty hard to get ahead of this thrust but I think it's worth trying, and I think that's what we have in mind.
And if I could just add an addendum to that, this actually presents, very quickly, this presents a policy challenge because in carbon markets, of course, one wants permanence. And to the degree that you're potentially facing some reversals, that is through wildland fire or pests, it complicates that carbon market context.
And all the more reason for good measurement and monitoring. So I saw the gentleman here. Do you, where's our microphone? So, okay, sorry about this, guys. If you will go ahead and can you project?
Yeah.
Stand up if you don't mind. Thank you.
In terms of the growth in
And your name first?
Oliver Josephs, the growth of carbon markets, how do you foresee the growth of monocultures such as easy offsets with bamboo that would be great offsets yet not native to the U.S.? How do you see the growth of things like bamboo or other easy offsets internationally? And I compare this to something like coal scrubbers to suddenly reduce all the emissions up into the air going straight into the water. I could see big problems in terms of biodiversity and animals as well. I mean, there's so many things that could be affected, and I just wanted to get your perspectives.
Well, I'll make a quick response. That, of course, is exactly what I was alluding to in talking about the Fish and Wildlife Service concern as the U.S. develops, and internationally as we develop protocols for carbon sequestration, having a multi-dimensional look at the challenge so that we don't drive things in that direction. The good news is there's a lot of recognition of that challenge. And in my conversations domestically and internationally, a desire not to end up with that kind of unintended pathway. So I think there's some care and attention being paid as these metrics are developed and as the markets come forward to avoid that circumstance. Doesn't mean it wouldn't happen anywhere, but I think there's a lot of attention to it. Jim?
This is a really big issue, and when we started out with the Clinton Foundation, one of our first studies was the question of the financing of the carbon projects and how do you do it. We asked McKinsey to do a study for us, and then we brought together a big group to do the study. And unfortunately, the result of their study was the best thing to do is to plant monocultures and to move out all the indigenous people. No, I don't think so. That's not going to work. But it tends to be a mindset if one doesn't think, as Lynn was saying, about the whole aspect of how you can actually make things happen. One thing that has been discovered over the years, and I think Roger's even written on this, is the fact that living in the forest will help protect the forest. And so you have to find a way to engage the local communities. In Guyana, just to finish this up, in Guyana, the president, as he looks at his low-carbon development strategy, has said, we will let the Amerindian community opt in or opt out, depending on how they see money flow and things really helping our community. And in the end, that's the only thing that's going to work. Not to say that you can't do some monocultures. You know, if you replace soil palm in Indonesia with sugar palm, turns out this is much better. But, you know, it's an interesting topic.
Just one statistic in terms of the magnitude of this thing. The total world's forest is about 400 billion hectares. The amount of world forest in planted forest is less than 200 million, so that's less than 5%. So you could double that without dramatically changing the global mix. That's a good point.
I think I'd like to collect 2 or 3 questions, just in the interest of getting them on the table. So Lisa, go ahead and wherever you see, raise your hand really high for Lisa. So we'll take 3 questions and then turn it over to the panel.
Hi, Jessica Lieber with Climate Wire. I see these forest carbon markets are, going to be worth billions of dollars, but they're going to take, several years or more to develop as you develop the capacity and measurement strategies. But meanwhile, I see a lot of pressure for biofuels development around the world, and that's kind of happening now. And I'm wondering how that interacts how that interacts. And one example is that this week, this roundtable of sustainable palm oil met in Malaysia, and all the stakeholders couldn't really agree on what it means to measure their carbon emissions. So just wondering if you could comment on that.
Good, thanks. Okay. Right over your right shoulder, there you go.
I'm Alan Roth, writing a book on climate change on the advanced fusion system. The question is on the economics of the carbon in dense tropical rainforests, where an example I read was some millions of hectares being cleared in Kalimantan, in Borneo, for palm oil, where they estimated 500 tons of carbon per hectare. And with millions of hectares at $20 or so per ton of carbon, we're talking about many billions, maybe $30 billion for one very large project. But how many of those could we actually pay for if the carbon, we're dealing with such large amounts of carbon at $20 a ton?
Let's take one more.
I'm Paul Schrupp from George Mason University. My question is really, where does the forest end? There's been this discussion of forests and the rate discussion of down to 10 or 20% tree cover is considered a forest. We've been talking here about heavily forested tropical regions. And the real issue is in a lot of areas with heavily degraded ecosystems from subsistence agriculture and things. A lot of native forest has been just kind of wiped out, and it's kind of subsistence agriculture there now. If you can restore those ecosystems and let natural systems come back, they'll be doing reforestation in the middle of what's now agriculture. Your thoughts on the distinction between thinking of terms of traditional rainforest, well-defined concepts that we know, and other things that might be happening.
So let me ask Roger to start with the first two questions on biofuels and the palm oil problem that Alan mentioned. And ask Lynn in particular to chime in on the last question about ecosystems more generally. And then I think Jim has no doubt significant words of wisdom about how you balance these trade-offs, because you've got 4 projects going on in countries where you face these in real time on a daily basis. So.
Yeah, there is almost a raging debate now in the literature with respect to biofuels and some of the implications. I read a couple of papers, one within the last 3 weeks in Science by Serginger and et al. And the argument here, and it's the same for palm oil basically, the argument here is that if we use biofuels, and in order to establish this dedicated biofuel activity, we need to clear natural forests or natural systems, we need to disturb those and convert those, that there are going to be very large emissions, carbon emissions associated with the land use change, and that will take years in order to recapture those emissions. And the most egregious, supposedly, is palm oil, where it's may take 60, yes, it's estimated to take 60 plus years of biofuel substituting for fossil fuel to make up for the carbon emissions associated with converting a tropical forest swamp from that natural tropical forest to a palm oil plantation. So there are a lot of issues here. The tendency has been to treat all biofuels as carbon neutral. We're beginning to recognize that not all biofuel feedstocks are equal. Some of them have different implications with respect to net carbon emissions than others. But it's an ongoing debate right now.
Lynn?
Let me just add an addendum to what Roger said and then address the question of where does the forest end, or what the implications of that question might be. I think the comment that Roger just made also links back to the question about monocultures that was asked. And reaffirms a point that I have made while at Interior as we struggled with protocols for carbon sequestration on interior lands, but then also was an issue in the Climate Commission. And that is the importance of having a more holistic rather than unidimensional view as we look at these things. While climate change is a significant challenge and trying to prevent deforestation and enhance carbon sequestration to mitigate climate change is important, if we do that unidimensionally, what we're going to do is simply have problem shifting and have challenges, whether they're in the form of monoculture or the form of unintended consequences of having one fuel actually achieve one goal but create others. To the issue of where does the forest end, I'm not quite sure the thought behind that question. Answering it sort of depends on what problem set you're trying to address. In the context of carbon markets, most carbon market constructs are predicated on the idea of 4 different dimensions with respect to forestry. There's afforestation, that is actually planting forests in new places that hadn't been forests. There's reforestation, that is reintroducing forests where they used to be. There's avoiding deforestation, that is sustaining intact existing tropical and other forests. And then there's avoided degradation, a key element that we shouldn't forget, that is in the management of existing forests, doing so with practices that are most beneficial in terms of sustaining forest health and carbon sequestration. So, to some extent, the question of where does the forest end and where does the forest begin, in the context of carbon markets, will play out in the calculations of how much a given stand, a given area yields in terms of carbon sequestration. And that will vary. That is, every acre is not going to be alike, as Roger well articulated. If your question was, though, well, what does all this mean for existing agriculture, and is this going to be the replacement of agriculture, and what happens to the folks who were earning a living in those places, and now we're reintroducing trees, reforesting, and we're displacing these people? That's a very different kind of policy question. That gets to some of the points that Jim Baker has mentioned, which is how do we, on the one hand, both reforest and avoid deforestation, but at the same time look at communities, poor and otherwise, and ensure that they have some sort of ability to sustain their agricultural or other livelihoods. And again, it becomes, from the policymaker standpoint, a very significant, challenging balancing act. I'm not sure what lay behind your question, but those 2 different angles seem to present different kinds of responses.
Well, and also the question had a very fundamental, how many trees constitute a forest, which is a fundamental definitional issue that is wrestled with all the time for policy reasons and measurement reasons. But that said, this was a nice explanation.
Well, let me just on that. I mean, partly, while that might be an area of inquiry, my answer was trying to get at that in the first context, which is, in some respects, getting all tangled around the axle on that definitional question is not as important as asking the question for any given setting in a carbon market, what are we actually likely to achieve in that setting by way of carbon sequestration? And it doesn't matter whether that setting carries the label forest. The question is, what is the forest productivity and what is the sequestration you're getting in that setting?
Thanks very much. Jim, I'm going to let you have some of the last words.
Okay. Let me just say a word about that last question, which is really interesting. The IPCC has come up with definitions of forest, 30% land cover, and how high trees have to be, and so on. But in the end, what's the practical way of dealing with this? For some countries to get into the world of saving forests, forest, non-forest, with relatively inaccurate definitions of both is really the way you get started, because if you can stop cutting down the forest, that's a good start on the policy. For other countries, you look at a country like Guyana, you take a satellite picture of the forest and you take another satellite picture of the forest a few years later, the forest may look the same, but in fact there is selective logging going on that goes in and picks the high-density, most important trees, drags them out without any trace, moves them down the river, and you end up with a forest that looks the same but has less carbon density. And so how do you then enter into your world of regulation and carbon markets with that kind of information? So what you have to do is, as Roger was pointing out, that there has to be, from the outset, a combination of field plot measurements and people on the ground together with satellite information that is tailored to the specific needs of the countries. In Guyana, we look at those specific areas of degradation. In Tanzania, we look at where we're growing new forest, for example. So it's very different depending on the country.
Good. Let me ask Lynn or Roger if you have any last comments, and otherwise I'm going to thank everyone and see everyone in December. Last word? Okay? Go ahead.
Let me just add to Jim one more element. A third, I suggested two policy contexts for that. Where is the forest in? The third is precisely the one Jim settled on, which is it really does play into the question of leakage. Is a forest if a nation sets a national forestry coverage goal? And that just brings us right back to where Roger started us, which is the incredible importance of further refining our metrics and doing the monitoring and verification over time.
I'm glad I let you have the last word. Thank you. Thank you all very much, and see you in December.